The message arrived quietly. No alarms. No emergency meetings. Just a report folded into the machinery of intelligence. One among thousands racing toward D-Day. It came from the ground. From occupied France, where the air smelled of fuel and fear, and German units were moving in ways that did not match the plan. Roads were tightening. Checkpoints multiplying. Something was shifting behind the lines, something the maps did not reflect. Yet the warning said the landings would not be easy. It said defenses were stronger than expected. That certain beaches were no longer what planners believed them to be. That the cost would be higher. The report was logged, and set aside, because the invasion could not wait. In London, D-Day had already become momentum. Troops were loaded, timetables fixed, weather windows narrowing. Changing course now meant unraveling the largest operation ever attempted. So the warning remained where it was. And when the landings began, history would remember courage, sacrifice, and victory. What it would not remember is that someone had tried to speak before the blood reached the sand. Her name was Violette Chabot. She was not ignored because she was wrong. She was ignored because the war had already decided to move forward. By the spring of 1944, the war had narrowed to a single question: where and when would the Allies return to Europe? Years of planning had converged into one operation so vast that altering it felt almost impossible. Millions of men were staged across southern England. Supplies filled ports and airfields. Deception campaigns convinced German intelligence that the invasion would come elsewhere, later, or not at all. Every part of the machine depended on timing. Day was no longer just a plan. It was momentum. Yet beneath the scale and certainty, the operation depended on fragile assumptions. Beach defenses were mapped from the air. Enemy strength was estimated through intercepted signals and partial reconnaissance. What planners lacked most was fresh, ground-level truth, what German units were actually doing in the days immediately before the landings. That truth could only come from inside occupied France. Resistance networks watched roads, bridges, and troop movements at enormous personal risk. Their reports were short, imperfect, and often delayed, but they carried something aerial photographs could not: intent. When checkpoints multiplied, when units shifted without orders, when patrol patterns changed, it meant the enemy sensed something. Those signals mattered because D-Day left no margin for surprise. Allied planners understood that success depended on confusion. If German defenses stiffened even slightly, the first hours on the beaches could turn catastrophic. Reinforcements could arrive faster. Artillery could be repositioned. What looked like a manageable landing could collapse into chaos. This is why the warning carried weight. It did not claim the invasion would fail. It did not demand cancellation. It said something more dangerous: that reality on the ground no longer matched the assumptions guiding the plan. That certain beaches were harder, certain routes more guarded, certain units more alert than expected. But acknowledging that meant confronting a dilemma no planner wanted. Delay risked losing the weather window. Delay risked exposing the deception. Delay risked unraveling years of preparation. So the intelligence was filtered through necessity. Reports that aligned with expectations moved quickly. Reports that complicated them moved slowly. The system did not silence warnings outright, it deprioritized them. trusting that scale, surprise, and courage would absorb the difference. In doing so, it accepted higher risk at the point of impact. When the landings began, the cost of that acceptance became visible. Some beaches held. Others turned into killing zones. Units landed under heavier fire than anticipated. Timetables fractured. Success was achieved, but not on the terms planners had hoped. History would later call D-Day a triumph, and it was. But triumph can coexist with preventable loss. The warning mattered because it spoke to that. Space the narrow band where better. Information could have reduced the bloodshed without changing the outcome. That is why this moment deserves attention, not because the invasion should have been stopped, but because someone on the ground saw the danger sharpening and tried to say so before the tide came in. Violet Chabot did not look like a soldier. She was young, spoke softly, and carried herself with a calm that disguised how dangerous her work had become. To those who met her briefly, she could pass as a courier, a relative, a woman moving through occupied France for reasons no one needed to question too closely. That ordinariness was her protection and her burden. Before the war, her life had been unremarkable. There was no path toward espionage, no ambition to become a symbol. The war chose her, the way it chose so many others, by erasing the future she had expected and replacing it with necessity. When she joined the Special Operations Executive, it was not ideology that carried her forward, but resolve. Chabot's value was not in sabotage alone. It was in observation. She moved through towns and villages, where German presence could not be hidden by maps or reports. She noticed how soldiers stood at checkpoints, how quickly documents were inspected, how often convoys passed roads that had once been quiet. These details were not dramatic, but they were decisive. They told her when an area had shifted from routine occupation to alert readiness. By early 1944, that shift was unmistakable. German units were not panicking, but they were tightening. Patrols overlapped. Defensive positions were reinforced without fanfare. It was not the behavior of an army surprised. It was the behavior of one that suspected something imminent. Chabot reported what she saw. Her warnings were cautious, grounded, and specific. She did not claim knowledge of invasion dates. She did not exaggerate enemy strength. She said something simpler and more troubling. The ground was no longer as permissive as Allied planners believed. The margins were shrinking. From her perspective, the danger was obvious. From London, it was less so. Her reports entered a system designed to manage scale, not nuance. Intelligence streams converged, merged, and were prioritized based on relevance to the plan already in motion. Information that challenged assumptions required time to validate time. The operation no longer had. Chabot could not see that machinery. She could only report what reality presented to her. And reality did not pause. Shortly after her final mission began, German counterintelligence closed in. Networks were compromised. Routes collapsed. Chabot was captured after a firefight that left no ambiguity about the stakes she had been operating under. Her warning would not be repeated. Her voice would not return. History often framed such figures as heroes of resistance, frozen in moments of bravery and sacrifice. But doing so risks missing the quieter truth of her role. Chabot was not only courageous, she was perceptive. She understood how danger announces itself, not loudly, But through accumulation, by the time the invasion came, her warning had already been overtaken by events. The beaches would be taken. The operation would succeed. But the cost would reflect the reality she had tried to describe. Her story matters because it reveals a different side of intelligence, one where accuracy does not always translate into influence, and where truth arrives in pieces that systems under pressure struggle to absorb. She did not fail to see the danger. The landings began before dawn. As Allied troops moved toward the beaches of Normandy. The plan unfolded with the precision only years of preparation could produce. Naval guns opened fire. Paratroopers dropped inland. The largest armada in history pushed through the dark, carrying the future of Europe with it. But the ground did not respond evenly. On some beaches, resistance collapsed faster than expected. On others, it hardened into something planners had not fully anticipated. Defensive positions were stronger. Fields of fire overlapped more tightly. Units that were supposed to be slow to react were already moving. This was the reality Violet Chabot had tried to describe. The German defenses had not discovered the invasion plan, but they had sensed it. Their posture reflected anticipation rather than surprise. That difference mattered in the first hours, when momentum could be gained or lost by minutes. At Omaha Beach, the cost became visible almost immediately. Troops landed under intense fire. Obstacles funneled men into kill zones. Timetables disintegrated. Units that were meant to advance found themselves pinned down, improvising under pressure. Success was achieved not through design, but through sacrifice. Small groups pushing forward without coordination. Adapting in real time to conditions the plan had underestimated. The invasion did not fail, but it did not unfold as cleanly as intended. Casualties climbed where resistance had stiffened. Commanders made decisions on the ground that deviated sharply from pre-invasion expectations. In those moments, the difference between victory and disaster narrowed to individual judgment and endurance. By the end of the day, the beachheads held. History would later compress these hours into a single word: success. Yet success can obscure cost. The warnings from the resistance did not predict defeat. They predicted friction, places where assumptions would collide with reality. That friction consumed lives. It slowed advances. It forced improvisation under fire. Could the invasion have been delayed or redirected? Perhaps not, but acknowledging the warning might have altered preparation, adjusted landings, reinforced specific sectors, or revised expectations in ways that reduced casualties. These are not questions history likes to linger on, because they challenge the idea of inevitability. The broader consequences unfolded quickly. Once the beachheads were secured, Allied momentum surged. Supplies poured in. German responses fractured under Allied air power and logistics. The liberation of Western Europe began in earnest, and yet the opening hours left a mark. They demonstrated the limits of planning at scale. They revealed how even the most detailed operation depends on fragile assumptions about enemy behavior. And they exposed the cost of sidelining ground-level intelligence when it complicates a timetable already in motion. Violet Chabot did not witness these outcomes. Her warning lived on only in fragments, folded into reports that history would not revisit. The invasion succeeded without her voice, but not without paying the price of ignoring it. The paradox of D-Day is this: it was both a triumph and a reminder that success does not erase the consequences of overlooked truth. After the war, D-Day became a monument. It was remembered as the moment when courage, planning, and sacrifice aligned to change the course of history. Films, books, and ceremonies fixed its image in public memory, soldiers charging ashore, commanders making decisive calls, liberation beginning at sunrise. There was little room in that story for hesitation. Acknowledging that warnings from the ground had been sidelined would have complicated the narrative of control. It would have suggested that even the most carefully planned operation in history moved forward with unresolved doubts, and that some losses were not simply the price of war, but the result of choices made under pressure. So those warnings faded. Resistance intelligence was often anonymous by design. Reports were unsigned, fragmented, and filtered through multiple layers before reaching decision-makers. When outcomes were later assessed, there was no single name to attach to foresight. No clear moment to point to and say, "This should have changed things." Violet Chabot's role was further obscured by her fate. Captured before the invasion, she could not speak for herself. She left no memoir to frame her warning, no post-war presence to insist on its importance. Her story became one of bravery and sacrifice, honored but simplified. The substance of what she observed was absorbed into a larger, quieter loss. There was also the problem of victory. D-Day worked. Once success is achieved, history tends to reinterpret everything that came before as necessary. The invasion's triumph made earlier doubts seem irrelevant, even inconvenient. Questioning preparation after the fact risked undermining the moral clarity of a turning point. The world needed to believe in that, and so the warning was not denied. It was outgrown. The narrative moved on to liberation, reconstruction, and the end of the war. The intelligence that complicated the opening hours was left behind, filed under details that no longer appeared to matter, but forgetting it comes at a cost, because it reinforces a dangerous myth that large victories are immune to small truths, and that success retroactively justifies every decision that preceded it. D-Day proved that courage can overcome uncertainty, but it also proved something quieter and more uncomfortable, that even when history moves in the right direction, it does not do so cleanly. That warnings can be accurate, timely, and still lose relevance when momentum takes over. And that truth, when it arrives at the wrong moment, is often treated as an obstacle rather than a guide. Violet Chabot's story does not challenge the necessity of the invasion. It challenges the belief that success means nothing else could have been done. Her warning was not about stopping history. It was about refining it, about recognizing that the enemy was adapting faster than the plan assumed, and that the margin for error was thinner than expected. Those margins were paid for in blood. Modern intelligence doctrine now emphasizes what her experience illustrates so clearly, that ground truth matters, that local observation can expose blind spots in grand strategy, and that information which complicates a plan is often the most valuable kind. But doctrine is written after the fact. In the moment, leaders must choose between adjustment and action, between delaying to absorb new information and moving forward while the window remains open. Those choices are never clean. They are made under pressure, with incomplete knowledge and irreversible consequences. Violet Chabot did not live to see the liberation she helped make possible. Her contribution did not change the date of D-Day or the direction of the war. What it offers us instead is perspective, a reminder that history is shaped not only by those who decide, but by those who observe clearly and speak before the outcome is known. She saw the danger sharpening, She tried to say so.It, and even though history moved forward without stopping, the cost of that choice still echoes in the sand where the first waves landed. That is why her story matters, not because it rewrites victory, but because it reminds us that behind every triumph lie truths we chose not to fully hear.